Charleston Forum was birthed right after the tragedy at Mother Emanuel AME Church in June of 2015. The forum, that has been around for several years now, centers around conversations about race, equity, criminal justice, education, and more. Today, I talk one-on-one with the CEO of the Charleston Forum, Brian Duffy, about the event's first in-person event since 2019 for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Brian Duffy, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thanks very much. Always good to be with you, Quintin.
I appreciate it greatly. You are the CEO of the Charleston Forum, and of course, you have your own law firm there, Duffy and Young, right there on Broad Street. But the Charleston Forum has some exciting news for a lot of people here in the Low Country, because you're hosting your first in-person event since 2009. And I know that the panelists will be discussing public displays of history and public policy surrounding them here in South Carolina. I know that the program title will be Appreciating Each Other's History, Monuments, Memory, and the Future of the Past in the Palmetto State. What's new, what's now with the Charleston Forum this year?
I tell you what, Quintin, it is great to be back in person, and we're so happy that Morris Brown and Pastor Keaton are hosting us there, and really looking forward to a great event. And we're going to be not only hosting everybody from our community who's interested in going, we are going to be having dinner for free in advance. So come on out at 5 o'clock at Morris Brown, and then the show begins at 6. And the TV crews from C-SPAN will be there as well. So we're going to have a big event.
Yes, sir. And I'm sitting a couple of blocks away from Morris Brown as we speak. But I know, obviously, as I mentioned, you're going to have this particular event in person for the first time. Who will be the moderators of this event this year?
Well, we really have gotten very lucky, and we're fortunate in the panels that we have. As you know, Quintin, the first is going to be focused on our public history and really what is the landscape here. We're talking about statues, monuments, road names, and those kind of things. And how did it get that way, and why does it matter? And we have incredible panelists, but on top of that, our moderator, as you asked, we started off with Congressman Clyburn, and you can't get much better than that. Unfortunately, an event in Columbia has called him off, and we were able to bring down from Washington, D.C., John Simpkins, who has been such a great moderator for us in the virtual world over the past couple of years. We're very pleased to have him and his incredible skill at serving as a moderator be with us in person for this one. And so he'll be addressing the issues with the historians. And then the next panel, we're going to have the, I think, universally loved president of the University of South Carolina, who stepped in more recently to return to that role, Dr. Pastides. And so he'll be moderating the panel with public officials.
Yes, indeed. And matter of fact, he has a house here in Folly Beach, and I run into him all the time.
Oh, great.
Yo, yes, sir. And hopefully I'll get him on Quintin's Close-Ups eventually.
Yeah, that's right.
But I know that you talked about those panelists. Who will be the panelists for this particular event this year for both events?
Sure. Well, the first panel will be the historians really setting the stage for how we got here, where we are, and why it matters. And, we really couldn't be happier to have the most noted historian of South Carolina in Walter Edgar, and he'll be on the panel. And not only do we have him, we're welcoming back a panelist who had joined us in our very first Charleston Forum, Blaine Roberts, who is a historian who had been with the Citadel and is out at Cal Fresno right now. And she and her husband, co-professors or co-authors of a really well done book called Denmark Vesey's Garden, that really chronicles the history and how it's been represented from really the start of this area to today.
Wow.
And beyond those noted historians, we have someone who has really lived this history in the National Park Service, in Mike Allen, and he has a great perspective to share. And the Dr. Matthews, the CEO of the soon-to-be-opened International African American Museum, will round out that panel.
Yes, and that's going to be opening up in January of 2023. The news just came out yesterday, actually. And I know that you're going to bring, I believe, State Senator Marlon Kimpson, State Representative Shardell Murray, and others as well.
That's right. They'll be on the panel with public officials. So really, this first panel is going to bring it all together and set the stage, and then this next panel, the public officials, can say, okay, well, what do we do next? How should we address these things? What are the options? And we have certainly Senator Kimpson and Representative Murray, and they can address that from the state level, along with Representative Gil Gatch from the Somerville area. And they can address that, and we'll have Mayor Tecklenburg, who can focus more on the municipal area and what cities can do and what options are available to them and what Charleston has been considering.
Now, let me go back. The Charleston Forum announced today that the details of its first in-person event since 2019, that is, a program titled Appreciating Each Other's Histories, Monument, Memories, and the Future of the Past in the Palmetto State. Let me ask you this, Brian. How do we appreciate each other's history here in Charleston?
Tell you what, Quintin, I think we've largely ignored it. I think that people grow up with what they understand to be the history, and really that it's kind of odd how it happens, but I think it's very common. It becomes part of who you are and what your understanding is of the world and where you grew up. And things that you learn later or hear later, I think people find unsettling and are likely to reject those things unless there's a studied effort. And so we found, Quintin, as you know, we've done surveys the past couple of years, and it's interesting that what I see is the more substantive ways that we interact and that the public serves people through education, economic programs, policing and criminal justice. The surveys reveal that people in the Tri-County area agree on the goals for those things. The goals that every child should get an opportunity for a great education. And if we need to spend more to provide that opportunity to some kids who aren't in a position to get that as others are, then we're willing to do that. And so it's great to know that we see things the same way, and we differ on how we want to get there or what are the best ways to get there. But where we really don't agree, and the demographics and the surveys show that, is how we're dealing with history, what it represents, how we should deal with that. And I think that even though you just rationally think of that as a less substantive way that we interact as a community, I think it is a very much an emotional part of who we are that is somewhat of an obstacle, because I think if we don't see each other as one community in the Tri-County area, we aren't willing to do the things to reach our goals, to treat everyone the same way, or to provide opportunities for people who need it more. And so I think it's important that we look at each other and view this area as competing with other areas around the world. Now, we view this area as one community. And I think that this step of getting people to understand our history better and appreciate how it's represented in these public spaces and how we might do better in a way that's acceptable to everybody. It's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be perfect for anyone either, but in a way that's acceptable, and we can understand why it's that way and how we can do things better and take those steps. I think that gets us over a hurdle to be able to address these other areas from a more of a community-wide perspective.
What's acceptable right now, Brian?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Yeah, so what's acceptable that is right now in this public space?
Well, that's a great question, because for years the same thing had been acceptable, or at least from a public perspective acceptable, because there had been no action taken to address any of the ways that we had represented history. Obviously, after the Mother Emanuel massacre, which is what really gave rise to this forum, people started to look at things differently and say, well, wait a second, we do have a problem. Something led to this, and we can't let that happen again. And you see, the celebrated Confederate emblems and imagery and that type of thing from that murderer that inspired him to go so far beyond the pale here, that we need to understand how those types of things impact people and their perspectives of community. And so what's acceptable now, I don't think we know the answer to that, because now people are starting to realize, wait a second, these things do matter. And why then is this street named Calhoun Street? Why is a Calhoun statue there? Those things are now questioned. And I think that, as I mentioned before, there's no broad agreement on how they should be handled. And that's why we're trying to bring people together to say, all right, well, let's look at what things were, how these things are being presented, and why and when, and what do they mean to people, and how can we, understanding these different perspectives, tackle this in a I guess as I say, a way that's more acceptable to the whole community going forward. And I don't think we know that answer yet.
How has the past allowed us to really appreciate monuments in Charleston?
Well, I think Charleston celebrates its past, and in large part, there are great things to celebrate. It was it's a beautiful place. There are beautiful structures, there are beautiful homes, and there was a lot of wealth here that allowed for that. A lot of in time, more open perspectives on religion that allowed different faiths here, and there are beautiful monuments to that. But certainly, the story of slavery and African Americans' experience has always been, I guess, muted to some degree. And so, how things are displayed here and haven't told the whole story. And that's not to say that everyone is bad, or everyone who likes a monument is bad. It's just that we've got to understand and appreciate a more complete perspective, so that we can pass along the history and why those things are there, and what they represent, and why people think they're good and bad, and really how we might dedicate public spaces in the future.
What are the stories that have not been told accurately so far?
Well, I think I would tell you, I've read a lot on the subject, and I certainly would recommend Professor Roberts' book to anyone. It really chronicles the views at the time that these things were happening. And so it is, certainly after the Civil War, things were difficult in the South, and they wanted to paint a picture of things not being as bad as slavery not being as bad as it really was, Jim Crow not being as bad as it really was. And so, it's hard it made it difficult for an accurate public display of history. And so when people are honoring those things, they're honoring part of the past. And, and that just needs to be understood, so that the myths, for example, of the happy slave, of really, everybody, this was a good thing for people. I think, Quintin, I think that is what people were portraying at the time, to sort of get beyond those real raw, bitter feelings of, people lost family members, they lost their livelihoods, they lost a lot of things who were and that's not to compare anything to the horrors of slavery, but it was a trying time for them, and that was a way, I think, to try to make things better going forward. But today, what I really think, just having grown up here, what I think people are really, I guess, kind of reject about having a full appreciation and understanding and retelling of history is they don't like, first of all, that's not their current history, their lives. They didn't do these things. They don't want to be sort of accused of being terrible people or having a terrible heritage and that type of thing. But on top of that, it was ultimately a war between the North and South. And people in the South don't want people in the North telling them, we're right, you're wrong, you were bad people. And the reaction really from people of the South isn't to say anymore slavery was a good thing. I don't think anybody would suggest that in a rational conversation. But I think what people do say is they deflect that part of the argument and say, oh yeah, well, you were pretty bad up there too, so don't be telling me how bad we were. And they can go through all the horrors for African Americans in the North, which were plenty. And so I think that it's more of a deflection now than it is necessarily a reshaping of the history, which I think is what happened closer to the time.
When it comes to current history, Brian, what are those things that are really being deflected right now in your mind?
Well, I think that from the monument perspective and the public displays, I think that people, and contemporary people have grown up with images of these Confederate heroes, if you will, and statesmen of the time as great contributors to society. And I think and your question was what's being hidden now, or I guess
yeah, basically.
And I think what's starting to emerge is that, well, wait a second, these monuments weren't put up really. The impetus or the motivation for putting up these monuments wasn't just to honor these people. They were put up at times and for reasons that, when you look at the speeches dedicating them around the South, or you look at the time they were put up or who they were honoring, it was really to reinforce a social structure that was more, that was prevalent at that time, and people wanted to continue and wanted to keep that sort of structure in place of economic, social privilege, etc. And by elevating these figures and what they really meant and represented was a not so subtle way of pressing that on everyone else.
What is that social structure now with this current history?
Well, that's a great question and a very complicated one to answer. It certainly has. I mean, you can look at the housing patterns and educational patterns. We had. I still remember from our first forum, and DeRay McKisson from Black Lives Matter, who was a wonderful panelist, said. I believe I remember that he was the first in his family to go to college. And essentially, went back and said, well, we were, his ancestors and generations ahead were prohibited from reading. I mean, not only could they not go to school, but they weren't allowed to read. And so, that's really not so long ago. And so, when you have housing patterns and when you have economic opportunities that are when you sort of grow from those times, it's not necessarily that these things and these patterns are intentionally done now, but the system that led us here has perpetuated a lot of those things. And so without some intentional shakeup, then that history continues to have an impact today in a lot of ways.
And I know this might be a off the beaten path question, but how has Charleston grown so far from its history?
Well, it's I think in a lot of ways it's leadership. It's leadership in government. Mayor Riley had really just been a transformational figure for this area. And Quintin, I'm a believer that when you see different things and you meet different people, you become more open-minded to those views. And Charleston just naturally is more like that as a port city, and with so many different interests and international things moving through here, I think that it's a natural growth that you become more open rather than insular. And I think that those things, the economic opportunities have led us there, and and to some degree, public leadership.
And I want to get back to that in just a second, but let me ask you this. This might be a silly question, Brian, but what is your personal memory of appreciated history?
Personal memory of appreciated history. I don't know that this exactly fits where you're going, Quintin, but this is what came to mind. Okay. And I think it relates to people like you're talking about, people who made a difference by trying to shake things up and show, wait a second, this isn't right. Here's how we need to do things. And I think from my perspective, it is respecting those figures and honoring those figures. And what comes to mind for me is being a little kid riding in the back of my mom's car when she was giving Septima Clark a ride somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
Ms. Clark needed a ride. She was going to a presentation or a meeting or something, and my mom was involved with a group who was helping promote that, and we were giving her a ride. And it wasn't that my mom, we didn't study the efforts that Septima Clark was involved in, but I understood from that moment that she and what she was working towards was very important, and that she was someone who deserved great respect. And my mom was willing to she was a very busy person herself, go out of her way to help Ms. Clark and help facilitate what it was that she was doing. And so I think, my personal view of where that comes from, of appreciating history, is appreciating those figures who are helping shape it, Quintin.
And do you believe the current public leadership in this town and in this region really appreciates current history?
I think that's tough. Also, I think that the nature of our political system right now is very difficult. Whether any of the individuals appreciate it more than they let on, I don't know. But I'll say that I'm encouraged more by local politics, as I think it's closer to the people, it's closer to the community, sure. and can get away from the distraction of more polarizing national politics. And so I do think there's a lot to be encouraged about. You can look at the support for the International African American Museum. Right. It seems natural and easy, but there's a time when it wouldn't have been there. So I do think there's a lot to be encouraged about, though it's certainly not a perfect situation.
How do current conversations and actions around statues or racist historical figures affect the direction of public history in this particular state?
Well, I think it's very important. We've obviously had two major developments in that regard, in the removal of the Confederate flag from the State House grounds and the removal of the Calhoun Monument. Those things are very, very divisive issues, but I think they help open the conversation. And I think what you don't want. I think the most encouraging thing is A, people are paying attention to it, and B, is something we can address through government and public works, because as troubled as the history, for example, of Silent Sam on the University of North Carolina's campus was, I think it's a dangerous precedent that you have people going out and taking it down themselves. Not only is that dangerous, but it creates more of a bitter reaction rather than the coming together and talking through what's the best way of moving things forward. That people, as I said before, can accept, understanding different perspectives. Though I look at it, Quintin, probably a little bit differently than others, because I see it a lot like a lawsuit in mediations with competing views on something, and the mediation works so well because people can come together, they can say their piece, and they can hear what other people say. I'm like, all right, I know they're not going to come to exactly what I believe, but I understand where they're coming from, and here's something we can do that everybody can accept. You know, it's not that it's perfect. One side loves it and says, aha, we won. But it's a way that as a community and in a democracy, you can move forward in a way that is respectful of everyone.
And what are those local benefits when it comes to public history?
The local benefits with public history, I think, certainly the first thing that comes to mind for anybody in Charleston would be tourism. I mean, you are showing off your public history, and people are interested in it. And I think the better and more full accounting you can give of it, I think the more interesting that is.
What is the difference between, this is simplistic, but history and collective memory when you think of public history and these monuments and its past?
Well, Quintin, I think that it's important because everyone gets history in their history books going through school. All right, so you have whatever that is that's being presented, which of course is controversial today too. But beyond that, you're not reminded of it on a daily basis. You don't see things or ask questions about history on a daily basis, except how it is publicly presented. That's where you see these things. And so that's why it really does help, for good or bad, shape the views people have of a particular area. I mean, if somebody came here and you saw, a history to a war criminal, you wouldn't think very much of that area. You know what I mean? It really helps shape people's perspective of the area and and people of the area's views on what the proper view of history really is.
How is consensus history promoted throughout our state?
Well, again, I think that's something that's really up for debate now. I think that it has been, largely ignored and just proceeding along in the same old way for years, and that now there are competing views of why that should change. And I think it's a very interesting discussion, an important one, and hopefully the Charleston Forum is helping move it in the right direction.
And what substantial changes in the public history landscape, that is, have actually been made within our state and region since June 17, 2015?
Well, that's, we discussed the two clear ones for our area right now. And I'd encourage anybody who wants a more complete accounting of that to come listen in at the forum, because we're going to have the experts who have been studying those things and ready to talk through really not only what's happened here, but how does it compare to what's going on in other areas.
And I'm sitting literally right down the street from Marion Square, but how has the Charleston's public history landscape after the removal of John C. Calhoun statue changed?
I think people see both that they have some voice in how it happens, because it was a vote in city council of what was going to happen, and so that was a response to the will of the vocal majority now. And I think people that bit makes them more engaged, that people can see they can have an influence on what has been literally set in stone all their lives.
And I've talked to a lot of the council members about this, and I want to ask you this too, but can Charleston's current public history landscape survive after the removal of that statue?
Well, that's a good question. As you know, the city has dedicated a lot of effort to having a commission study that and have some controversial findings on how to move forward. And Quintin, always, I would love to set up another time to spend more time with you, but I have another Zoom call in less than 60 seconds.
Okay, thank you for your time, Brian Duffy. I appreciate it here on Quintin's Close-Ups.